You know, usually when we talk about a toll road, there's like a very predictable annoyance to it.
Right. It's a known quantity.
Exactly. You expect to throw a few coins in a basket or, maybe swipe a card or have your transponder beep. It's just this minor inconvenience on the way to your destination. You budget for it. It's clean, right?
Yeah, completely standard.
But I want you to imagine just for a second that tomorrow morning you are commuting to work, right? You pull up to that exact same toll booth on the federal highway. But instead of $2, the local municipality has suddenly, I don't know, taken it over.
Oh, wow.
And they are demanding $1,000
Yeah.
just to pass. A 500 times price increase, literally overnight. And when you look in your rearview mirror to see if the highway patrol is coming to put a stop to this absolute madness, you realize the highway patrol is completely out of gas.
They're just sitting there.
Yeah, their cars are parked. They can't even start their engines.
And that paralyzed highway patrol, that is exactly the scenario playing out right now in what is, well, arguably the most critical maritime choke point on planet Earth, which is the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
We are looking at a situation where the fundamental rules of global transit are being rewritten in real time, and the traditional enforcer of those rules, the U.S., is suddenly finding its hands tied by its very own supply chains.
Which is exactly what we are unpacking in this deep dive into our source material today. We have a really fascinating, deeply geopolitical transcript to go through. It's a conversation between a prominent geopolitical analyst and a former CIA official.
It's incredibly dense stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Now, a quick disclaimer for you listening. This analysis contains some very strong opinions, heavily debated assertions, and, highly controversial viewpoints about the state of the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, the global economy, all of it.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back at all.
It really doesn't. So our mission today isn't to take a political side or, validate the morality of these moves. We are just acting as impartial guides. We want to unpack the facts and the geopolitical logic presented in the material.
Right, because we are looking at a world where supply chains dictate military strategy now.
Yes.
Where new laws of the sea are being drafted as we speak, and where the economic balance of power might be permanently altering, literally right beneath our feet.
And we have to start with, I think, the most immediate visceral shock to the global system that they discuss in the source, which is the staggering new transit fees being demanded.
Yeah, the numbers are just wild.
They are, because to understand the scale of what is being proposed in the Strait of Hormuz, you kind of have to understand the mathematical baseline of global shipping, like what is normal.
Right. Global transit fees for major choke points are, by design, incredibly low relative to the cargo they carry.
Okay, so give us an example.
So if you look at the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, those tolls usually hover around 0.1%, maybe 0.5% of the total cargo value on the ship.
Right, so it's essentially just a convenience fee.
Exactly.
The shipping companies are doing the math, like, does it cost me more in diesel fuel and crew wages to sail all the way around the Horn of Africa, or do I just pay this tiny fraction of a percent to cut through Egypt? And the math almost always favors the toll.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
When you look at the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the fee structure is even lower than that.
Really? How low?
We are talking 0.01% to maybe 0.1%. I mean, for a massive shipping conglomerate moving hundreds of millions of dollars in goods, it's practically a rounding error.
It's just friction, basically.
Yeah, it's friction, but it's totally manageable friction.
But the reality being laid out in our analysis completely obliterates that baseline. Like, we are not talking about fractions of a percent anymore. The reports indicate that Iran is demanding a transit fee for the Strait of Hormuz that sits between 5% and 7% of the total value of the cargo.
Which is just an astronomical escalation. I mean, if you take a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, carrying, say, 2 million barrels of oil.
Right, a massive ship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Depending on the spot price of oil, you are looking at well over $100 million of cargo on that one ship. A 5% fee means demanding $5, $6, maybe $7 million in cash just to sail through a 21-mile wide stretch of water.
That is insane.
Yeah.
And Oman is reportedly, stepping in to desperately mediate this whole thing, and they're coming back with a counteroffer of a permanent 3% fee.
Which is still huge.
Right. Mathematically, a 3% fee is still hundreds of times higher than what you'd pay in Turkey or Egypt. But there is a detail hidden inside this demand that we absolutely cannot breeze past because it changes the entire dynamic.
The currency issue.
Yes. These payments wouldn't just be wired in US dollars. The demand is that they must be paid in Chinese currency.
And this is where the economic maneuver shifts, right? It goes from a simple toll hike into a highly calculated systemic attack on the foundation of American economic dominance. We really have to look at the mechanics of the U.S. petrodollar system to understand why this matters so much to you, the listener.
Okay, let's break that down mechanically because, we hear the word petrodollar thrown around a whole lot, but how does it actually function in this specific context?
Okay, so for decades, dating all the way back to the 1970s, there has been this fundamental agreement structuring the global energy trade. And that agreement is that the world prices and settles its oil transactions in U.S. dollars.
Meaning everyone has to use American money to buy oil.
Exactly. If a country in Europe or Asia wants to buy oil from the Middle East, they can't just use their own currency. They first have to acquire U.S. dollars to make the purchase.
Okay, got it.
And this creates a massive artificial global demand for the dollar.
So because literally everyone needs dollars just to keep their lights on and their cars running, the United States can essentially print money, issue debt, and run massive deficits, right? Knowing that the rest of the world has to buy that American debt to get the dollars they desperately need for energy.
Precisely. It allows the U.S. to essentially export its inflation. The demand for the dollar props up the entire American economy.
Wow.
But if you force the thousands of ships transiting the most important oil choke point in the world to acquire and pay their massive transit fees in Chinese currency, you are systematically bypassing that petrodollar loop.
You're breaking the cycle.
Yes, you are artificially generating massive global demand for the renminbi while simultaneously eroding the necessity of the dollar.
It's an economic hostage situation. I mean, it's weaponizing the very geography of the Persian Gulf to force a shift in the global reserve currency.
That's exactly what it is.
But how is this justified internally? Like, when the people making this demand look at the situation, what is their rationale? Because in the analysis, one of the speakers tries to use this real estate analogy.
Right, the Dubai analogy.
Yeah. He compares renting an apartment in Dubai for $3,000 a month to renting a place in Des Moines, Iowa for $500. He's arguing that location dictates price, so you just can't compare the strategic value of Hormuz to the Turkish Straits.
He's making an argument based on strategic premium, basically. The real estate analogy is his way of saying that the world relies so heavily on this specific geographic choke point that it commands a luxury price tag.
But honestly, I really have to push back on that analogy.
Oh, for sure.
It's way too passive. It doesn't capture the aggression of what is actually happening here. It's not about luxury real estate versus rural real estate. It's exactly like the analogy we used at the start. It's a local municipality realizing they physically control the only bridge into a major city, bringing in their own cement barricades and demanding a $1,000 toll from commuters.
Yeah.
It's extortion by geography. So what is the actual justification they're using to defend this 500 times price hike?
Well, the framing is what makes this so incredibly complex. From the Iranian perspective laid out in our source analysis, these are not viewed as arbitrary tolls. And it's not just a geographical shakedown either.
Okay, so what is it?
These fees are explicitly legally framed as war reparations.
Reparations, really?
Yes. The underlying logic is based on decades of geopolitical conflict. The argument is that Iran has suffered massive infrastructure damage over the years. Their facilities have been bombed, they have lost thousands of lives, and they've endured decades of crushing, internationally enforced economic blockades that have completely devastated their economy.
So it's about payback.
Essentially, the 5% to 7% fee isn't just a random number they pulled out of thin air. It is a mathematically calculated mechanism designed to extract an estimated $200 billion in war reparations directly from the global economy.
So their logic is the international community either actively caused this damage or stood by and allowed it to happen through sanctions. So now the international community is going to pay the bill to rebuild our country.
Exactly. It's an enforced tax on global commerce to balance a historical ledger, at least from their perspective.
Okay, let's extrapolate the mechanics of that for a second, because if this becomes the new reality, like a permanent 3% or 5% or 7% tax on a massive chunk of the world's global energy transit, how does that mechanically trickle down to you and me?
It hits everyone.
What does that mean for the listener's daily life? Because we aren't just talking about a headline in the Financial Times here.
No, not at all. We are talking about a structural shift in the baseline cost of living globally.
Yeah.
If the cost of moving oil and liquefied natural gas out of the Gulf suddenly jumps by 5%, That cost is immediately internalized by the shipping companies.
Right.
And then they pass it to the refineries, who pass it to the distributors, who pass it directly to you. You will see it first and most visibly right at the gas pump.
Right, so fuel prices spike. But fuel is just the raw material of transportation. Like, literally everything we consume has to be moved.
Which is why the cascading effects are so severe. Because transportation costs go up. The cost of delivering a head of lettuce to your grocery store goes up. The cost of running the massive, energy-intensive factories that produce everything from clothing to cars goes up.
Everything gets more expensive.
Yeah. It acts as a highly inflationary blanket thrown over the entire global economy. If central banks are already struggling to contain inflation, a permanent transit tax on the Strait of Hormuz is like pouring gasoline on the fire.
Oh, absolutely.
It massively increases the probability of a deep, structural global recession, or, as the analysis ominously suggests, a potential global depression, simply because energy becomes too expensive to fuel economic growth.
But, demanding a price hike is one thing. Actually enforcing it is entirely different. You can't just put up a literal toll booth in the middle of the ocean.
Right. Logistically, it's tough.
So this brings us to the legal and physical mechanisms being put in place to actually back up this economic shock. Because we are looking at a bill that's currently passing through the Iranian parliament that effectively drafts an entirely new law of the sea for the region.
And the legislative maneuvers here are arguably more aggressive than the economic ones, because they dictate not just how much it costs to pass, but who is even allowed on the water in the first place.
Yeah, the legislation outlines 4 incredibly draconian points regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Let's walk through the mechanics of them because they're intense. Point number 1, a total prohibition of vessels belonging to the U.S., Israel, and, quote, other hostile countries from passing through the strait, period.
Just a total ban.
A total ban. Point number 2, a complete prohibition on any shipments, whether they are military or civilian, that are related in any way to Israel.
Which, if you think about it, requires an unprecedented level of surveillance and cargo inspection to actually enforce.
Absolutely. You'd have to check every single crate. Point number 3, bans on any vessels or cargoes that play any role in actions against the, quote, axis of resistance.
And that is the most subjective and broadly defined point of all of them. It essentially gives the local authority carte blanche to ban literally any ship based on political affiliation or just recent geopolitical maneuvering.
We don't like what your country said yesterday, so your ship can't pass.
Exactly.
And finally, point number 4. Any country or individual that has caused damage to Iran will not receive permission to pass until compensation is paid. And if you violate any of these new rules, you face heavy fines of up to 20% of your cargo's value.
A 20% fine. On a $100 million cargo, that is $20 million. It's astronomical.
Right. But how do you mechanically enforce a ban on U.S. ships in international waters? They're going to just string a giant net across the water. The strait is 21 miles wide.
Well, you don't need a physical wall.
Yeah.
You enforce it through asymmetric naval warfare and the mechanics of maritime insurance. You position anti-ship cruise missiles along the coast. You deploy swarms of fast attack craft armed with torpedoes. And crucially, you use the threat of sea mines. The mere credible threat that a strait is mined or that ships will be fired upon instantly nullifies maritime insurance policies.
Of course. The insurance companies. It always comes back to them.
Yes. Commercial shipping companies will not sail a $100 million vessel carrying $100 million of cargo if Lloyd's of London refuses to insure it.
Because if it sinks, they bankrupt their entire company.
Exactly. The physical enforcement only has to be terrifying enough to spook the insurance actuaries. Once the actuaries say no, the strait is effectively closed to whoever the local power deems hostile.
So they are weaponizing the insurance markets alongside the physical choke point.
Yes, very effectively.
If a single nation completely rewrites the rules of international commerce like this, setting up a private toll road with a highly political bouncer at the door, what happens if the global superpower, the United States, just says no? I mean, for nearly a century, hasn't the bedrock of the global economy been the U.S. Navy guaranteeing the freedom of navigation on the high seas?
It has. And that is the core tension of this entire situation. This is a massive, real-time test of national sovereignty versus global enforcement. The analytical concept discussed here is capitulation.
Okay, explain that.
Will the global enforcer capitulate to a regional power dictating the laws of the sea? Because the legislation creates a highly layered political filter for global trade. And the exceptions to these rules are just as important as the bans.
Right, because there are deliberate carve-outs in this bill. The intelligence suggests that countries like China and Russia are not going to be charged these 5% to 7% fees. Pakistan will likely get a free pass too.
Right, and this is deliberate economic fracturing. You are looking at the creation of a two-tiered global economy. On one side, you have the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their regional allies. They get free, or vastly discounted, transit through the most important energy corridor on Earth.
Meaning their manufacturing bases get much, much cheaper energy.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have Western nations and anyone deemed hostile. They either pay massive inflationary premiums that destroy their economic competitiveness, or they are banned entirely and have to route their energy halfway around the world at astronomical logistical costs.
Wow.
It acts as an enormous structural subsidy for Eastern manufacturing over Western manufacturing.
It's like an economic iron curtain dropping right over the Persian Gulf. Which immediately begs the natural question for anyone listening, why doesn't the U.S. military just step in and keep the strait open?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
If someone illegally blocks the federal highway, you send the highway patrol. If the U.S. Navy's entire post-World War II mandate is keeping sea lanes open, why aren't they just clearing the strait by force?
And this is where the geopolitical analysis drops its most staggering revelation. We have to connect this immense legislative boldness from Iran directly to the startling claims made in the source about U.S. military capacity.
Right.
We're talking about the reality of an empty arsenal.
Yeah, the intelligence points to a claim that honestly just stops you in your tracks. The United States is running out of weapons. Specifically, they're running out of the high-end, precision-guided munitions that totally define modern American power projection. Things like Tomahawk cruise missiles and JASSM.
Right, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles. These aren't just bombs. These are highly sophisticated, autonomous flying vehicles. They're the absolute tip of the spear.
And the analysis highlights that the U.S. reportedly used roughly 850 Tomahawks in just the first 5 weeks of recent regional conflicts.
Which is a massive burn rate.
To put the severity of that burn rate into perspective, the claim is that CNT Central Command has actually stood down its crisis action team, its 2047 CCAT.
Yes.
Because they fundamentally lack the munitions to plan for future, foreseeable military missions.
You really have to pause and absorb the gravity of that statement. A primary regional military command standing down its crisis response team. Not because the geopolitical crisis has been solved, but because the physical cupboards are bare.
They just don't have the tools.
They simply do not have the standoff weapons to execute the war plans.
It's the ultimate supply chain paradox. But I know what a lot of listeners are thinking, because I'm thinking the exact same thing. The United States has the biggest military budget on Earth by a massive multi-hundred-billion-dollar margin.
Right.
I know they have other weapons. I know the counter-argument here is that the U.S. has stockpiles of gravity bombs, traditional dumb bombs, and massive bunker busters. Can't they just pivot to using those?
It's a completely logical question.
Yeah.
But it requires an understanding of the mechanics of modern integrated air defense systems, or IADS.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, it's not just about having explosives, it's about the delivery mechanism.
Because delivery is everything.
Yeah,
You can have a million bombs, but if you can't get them to the target, they're just, expensive paperweights.
Exactly. A Tomahawk or a JASSM is a standoff weapon. That means a U.S. Navy destroyer or an aircraft can fire it from hundreds of miles away, well outside the range of enemy radar and surface-to-air missiles.
They stay safe.
Right. If you run out of standoff weapons, your only remaining option is to fly manned aircraft directly over the target to drop short-range or gravity bombs.
Which means putting pilots directly into the threat envelope.
Yes. And flying non-stealth aircraft like B-52 bombers or F-15s over heavily fortified airspace protected by advanced systems like the Russian-made S-300 or S-400 batteries that Iran possesses is practically suicidal.
Oh, wow.
You're flying into a buzzsaw. The layered radar and interceptor missiles would cause massive aircraft losses and pilot casualties. No commander wants to trade a $100 million aircraft and a highly trained crew to drop a $20,000 gravity bomb.
So the lack of standoff precision missiles fundamentally dictates what missions are even physically possible, completely, regardless of the overall budget.
Yes. And as for the bunker busters you mentioned, there's a mechanical reality to the geology of the region. The analysis brings up a very specific example referred to as Pickaxe Mountain.
What is the significance of that? I saw that in the notes.
So, Iran has spent decades observing U.S. air power. They know they can't win a dogfight. So they have adapted by building deeply fortified subterranean missile silos and military bases hollowed out deep inside solid granite mountains.
Deep underground.
Right. The physics of a bunker buster rely on kinetic energy and specialized casing to penetrate earth and concrete before detonating. But when you drop those penetrators on solid, fortified mountainsides, as the analysis bluntly states, it just blows up dirt.
Seriously, it doesn't penetrate.
No. The facilities are engineered thousands of feet deep specifically to withstand exactly that kind of kinetic impact.
So you can't reach the target safely because of air defenses. And even if you could risk the pilots, the gravity bombs you have left wouldn't penetrate the granite to destroy the targets anyway.
That's a dead end.
That is a terrifying tactical cul-de-sac. But I have to ask the mechanical why here. How does a multi-trillion-dollar defense apparatus just run out of ammo? Why can't the United States, the industrial powerhouse of the 20th century, just spin up a factory in Ohio or Texas and pump out more Tomahawks in a few weeks?
And this is the underlying mechanism that the analysis highlights, and it is arguably the most critical geopolitical vulnerability of the 21st century. The constraint is not money. Congress could appropriate $1 trillion tomorrow, and it wouldn't solve the problem immediately.
Okay, so what's the bottleneck?
The bottleneck is raw materials, specifically rare earth minerals.
Let's define that, because rare earth minerals sounds like science fiction, but it's just chemistry. We are talking about elements like neodymium, dysprosium, samarium.
Correct. And these elements are absolutely vital for modern technology. A Tomahawk missile isn't just explosives, it's a flying supercomputer.
Right.
It requires advanced guidance systems, highly precise gyroscopes to navigate without GPS, and powerful miniaturized magnetic actuators to move the fins that steer the missile at hundreds of miles an hour. You cannot build those components without rare earth magnets and alloys.
And here is the fatal flaw in the supply chain. Who controls the vast majority of the mining, and more importantly, the highly complex, highly toxic refinement of rare earth minerals globally?
China. Upwards of 80% to 90% of the refined rare earth market is controlled by Beijing.
And according to the geopolitical analysis we are looking at, China is actively refusing to supply these critical refined materials to the United States defense industry,
Which paralyzes the military-industrial complex. Now, people ask why the U.S. doesn't just mine them domestically.
Why don't we have mines?
The U.S. actually has rare earth deposits,
Mm-hmm.
but the chemical process of refining raw dirt into weapons-grade neodymium is environmentally devastating. It produces massive amounts of toxic and radioactive wastewater.
Oh, wow.
In the 1980s and 90s, the U.S. essentially outsourced that toxic industrial burden to China for cheaper prices. Now it takes a decade and billions of dollars to build a new, environmentally compliant refinement facility from scratch. You can't just flip a switch.
It's brilliant in a terrifying strategic way. It's geopolitical judo. You use your opponent's own profit-driven supply chain dependencies against them.
Exactly.
If the nation you are engaged in a proxy conflict with, like Iran, is allied with the nation that controls your absolute baseline supply chain, China, your military is effectively neutralized without a single shot being fired between the major powers.
It completely redefines what a superpower actually is.
Which perfectly transitions us from the physical battlefield into the political war room. Because if the military is literally out of standoff missiles and the supply chain to rebuild them is blocked by a rival superpower, the next obvious question is, does the leadership know?
Right.
How is the White House pushing aggressive foreign policy if the math doesn't support it? Are they just ignoring the data?
This brings us to the concept of the information bubble, which is, honestly, a chronic disease of executive leadership. The analysis brings up reports of a highly tense confrontation at Camp David involving Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and the reality of these severe munition shortages.
Right. The report suggests Trump confronted Hegseth about the lack of weapons, claiming he had been completely misled about the true state of the arsenal, and then Hegseth reportedly deflected the blame onto the Deputy Secretary of War, Stephen Feinberg, essentially saying that Feinberg hadn't ensured the president was fully briefed on the critical shortages.
It's a classic bureaucratic survival tactic. You point the finger down the chain of command.
But the reaction is what's truly fascinating. Trump reacted furiously on social media, threatening long-term jail sentences for the people who leaked this information to the public, labeling them as, quote, treasonous.
Yeah, that was intense.
Now, I have to highlight the sheer mechanical absurdity of calling this a treasonous leak. The analysts point out a brilliant reality here. This data about missile shortages isn't some highly classified dossier stolen from a subterranean vault by a spy. It is publicly available information.
It is entirely derived from open source intelligence, or OSINT.
Exactly. Anyone with a basic internet connection and an understanding of corporate finance can figure this out. You can literally read the congressional appropriations bills for the Department of Defense, and more importantly, you can look at defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and read their Schedule 8 investor reports or their 10K filings.
Right, because Lockheed Martin is a publicly traded company. They have a legal obligation to tell their shareholders exactly how many missiles they are building and delivering, because that drives their quarterly revenue and stock price.
So if you know mathematically that a company can only manufacture, say, 200 Tomahawks a year based on their public financial disclosures, and you can roughly count via CNN or Reuters that the military just fired 850 of them in 5 weeks, you don't need a top-secret clearance to realize the math doesn't work. You just need a calculator.
And this reveals something profound about the nature of executive power. The analysts contextualize this beautifully within the historical continuity of the presidency. This is not exclusively a Trump phenomenon.
Oh, not at all.
The analysis explicitly notes that modern presidents, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden, and Trump, have all frequently lived in heavily curated information bubbles.
But why does that happen structurally? Like, are intelligence officers just inherently afraid to tell the commander-in-chief bad news?
It's deeper than simple fear. It's about the psychology of policy commitment. When a leader, any leader, is heavily invested in a specific policy, for example, the policy of maximum pressure, or using military coercion to force a geopolitical rival to the negotiating table, they become psychologically resistant to data that contradicts the viability of that policy.
Because they've staked their reputation on it.
Exactly. The policy is their political brainchild. It's tied to their legacy.
It's confirmation bias operating at the absolute highest levels of global government.
Precisely. The bureaucracy learns what the boss wants to hear, and they filter the intelligence accordingly. But here is where the mechanics of that become incredibly dangerous. When a leader publicly threatens to jail advisors, or labels them treasonous for delivering bad news, even if that bad news is literally just reading a Lockheed Martin financial spreadsheet out loud, it alters the incentive structure of the entire intelligence apparatus.
You actively train your intelligence agencies to lie to you out of self-preservation.
Yes. You guarantee that in the future, you will only ever receive flawed, overly optimistic intelligence. You permanently blind yourself to tactical realities.
Which is the absolute worst time to be flying blind, because while American political leadership is arguing over spreadsheets, publicly traded stock reports, and leaking, Iran is actively changing the physical rules of engagement on the ground in the Middle East. And the stakes are far higher than just a few cargo ships.
Yeah, this is where the tactical analysis shifts from a regional maritime skirmish to a potential global catastrophe involving critical infrastructure.
According to the intelligence discussed, Iran specifically via a direct message delivered by Abbas Araki issued a stark, unambiguous warning to regional players: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. The message laid out a new red line. Any new U.S. attacks on Iranian territory of any kind will trigger immediate, overwhelming retaliation against all critical energy infrastructure across the entire Persian Gulf.
Mechanically, what they are doing is completely abandoning the traditional escalation ladder.
Yep. Right. Historically, proxy conflicts follow a predictable tit-for-tat rhythm. You bomb an empty warehouse. We bomb an isolated radar installation. It's a violent but controlled dialogue.
Yes, very measured.
But this threat says, if you strike us once, we bypass all the intermediate steps. We go straight to maximal existential destruction. They specifically threatened water desalination plants, massive oil refineries, sprawling oil fields, and U.S. military bases. They are holding the vital organs of the global energy grid hostage.
And we really have to analyze the sheer fragility of that infrastructure to understand the weight of the threat. The analysis highlights a mechanical detail about Gulf infrastructure that is almost entirely overlooked by mainstream reporting.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating.
Right. When most people think of a Saudi or Qatari oil field, they envision a massive, self-sustaining, indestructible industrial operation that just pumps money out of the sand indefinitely.
Like it just runs itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there is a fatal hidden flaw in that system.
Maintenance.
The industrial reality is that these facilities require constant, highly complex upkeep. The massive gas turbines, the specialized metallurgy, and the compressors for liquefied natural gas or LNG facilities, they break down constantly under the extreme heat and pressure of the desert environment.
Right.
And who performs the vast majority of that high-level technical maintenance in Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE?
It's not local technicians, it's Western contractors.
Hmm.
U.S. and European engineers running the IT, the mechanics, and the specialized software for the Gulf's energy output.
Exactly. And here is the true bottleneck. Where do those Western contractors store their highly specialized, custom-machined replacement parts? You can't just buy a turbine blade for a multi-billion-dollar LNG plant at a local hardware store.
Let me guess the logistics here. They store them in secure, centralized locations on U.S. military bases in the region?
Yes. The spare parts, the specialized tools, the diagnostic equipment, they are warehoused on U.S. military installations like Al Udeid in Qatar or NSA Bahrain.
Hmm.
Installations which, according to the threat scenario we are analyzing, are the primary targets that would be heavily damaged or cratered by ballistic missiles in the opening hours of a conflict.
So mechanically, even if the U.S. wanted to swoop in and help its allies rebuild after a massive Iranian preemptive strike on the oil fields, the very warehouses holding the spare parts are just smoking craters.
Without those specialized custom machine parts, and crucially, without a secure, safe environment for those highly skilled contractors to operate in, repairing damaged energy infrastructure wouldn't take days or weeks. You can't just patch a high-pressure natural gas pipeline with duct tape.
Of course not.
Rebuilding could take months or, realistically, years.
Okay, let's trace the mechanical ripple effect of that globally. Because if
Mhm.
the Gulf goes offline for a year, we aren't just talking about paying $8 a gallon for gas anymore. The cascading effects alter human survival.
The domino effect is staggering. If the Gulf's energy output vanishes, the global transportation grid seizes up almost immediately. The cost of shipping anything across any ocean skyrockets, leading to massive supply shortages of basic goods. But then it hits the secondary and tertiary industries.
Like technology. The price of semiconductors and computer chips explodes because chip manufacturing is one of the most incredibly energy-intensive processes on Earth. The fabrication plants require massive amounts of stable baseline power.
Yes, but the most terrifying mechanical link is agriculture. Modern farming relies entirely on nitrogen-based fertilizers.
The Haber-Bosch process.
Exactly. To create synthetic ammonia for fertilizer, you need massive amounts of natural gas as both a fuel and a chemical feedstock. If the natural gas from Qatar and the region vanishes, fertilizer production plummets and prices skyrocket.
And if fertilizer becomes too expensive for farmers in the developing world to buy, global food yields drop by 30%, 40%, maybe 50%. The global food delivery networks fracture.
It's catastrophic.
We are talking about the mechanics that trigger widespread famine conditions in vulnerable parts of the world, all tracing back to a single broken link in the Gulf's maintenance supply chain.
It really illustrates how the entire global economic and biological engine requires that specific Gulf infrastructure to just hum along quietly in the background.
Which brings us to the ultimate friction point.
Yeah.
How do these two opposing forces actually negotiate a way out of this standoff? On one side, you have demands for 500 times transit fees and doomsday threats against global infrastructure. On the other side, you have a superpower with an empty arsenal of precision weapons and a paralyzed supply chain.
Right, is a massive stalemate.
The analysts discuss this through the lens of Donald Trump's classic negotiating style, often referred to as the art of the deal approach.
It's a strategy historically built on the concept of overwhelming leverage. The methodology is to make extreme, outlandish threats, threaten to wipe out economies, demand complete capitulation on all fronts, to force the other side into a state of panic, hoping they offer major concessions just to de-escalate.
But the analysis points out a fatal flaw in applying that strategy in this specific geopolitical moment. The leverage doesn't exist anymore, and Iran has called the bluff.
They look at the empty holster.
Precisely. They have read the same open source intelligence we just discussed. They know mathematically that the U.S. is out of precision munitions. They know the U.S. cannot sustain a prolonged air campaign without unacceptable pilot losses. So instead of panicking at the aggressive rhetoric, they are ignoring it.
Yeah, they're not intimidated.
In fact, the intelligence notes they are continuing to build and test new generations of missiles. There are even reports they are receiving advanced missile shipments from China, effectively testing Chinese hardware in combat conditions against Western air defenses.
And crucially, they are firing these weapons from those untouchable underground silos we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
They're completely insulated from traditional kinetic threats.
Yeah.
The mechanics of deterrence have broken down.
So they aren't backing down an inch. The analysts outline Iran's original 14-point MOU, their Memorandum of Understanding demands. And they are massive, maximalist demands. They want the U.S. to unilaterally lift the blockade entirely, unfreeze all of Iran's financial assets globally, lift all economic sanctions, and, perhaps most explosively, force Israel to remove its presence from southern Lebanon.
And despite the aggressive rhetoric from the West, Iran hasn't moved a millimeter on those core demands.
This dynamic reminds me of a specific analogy mentioned in the analysis that I thought perfectly captured the absurdity of this negotiation. It was a tweet by a commentator named Chris Martinson analyzing how the U.S. frames these geopolitical losses.
Oh, the shifting goalposts analogy.
Yeah, it mechanically tracks the political spin. It goes like this. Initially, Iran announces, we're going to charge a 1% or 2% transit fee. The U.S. leadership is absolutely outraged. That's illegal. That's unacceptable. Here come the bombers. But then the U.S. realizes they literally don't have the bombs, and their supply chain is choked. The situation degrades on the ground. So Iran, sensing the weakness, raises the stakes. Okay, the fee is now 5% to 7%. And suddenly, the U.S. leadership goes on television and spins it, freezing the 7% fee as a great deal that avoided a larger war.
It's a masterclass in cognitive dissonance and narrative control.
So I have to ask you, looking at the geopolitical mechanics of this, is this framing just pragmatic politics when a leader is totally out of tactical options? Or is this, as the analysts strongly suggest, just complete and utter capitulation dressed up as diplomacy?
If you look at the raw mechanics of the situation, it leans heavily toward capitulation disguised by political pragmatism. The experts synthesize this beautifully by referencing Karl von Clausewitz, the famous military theorist, who stated that war is merely an extension of politics by other means.
Meaning military force is just a tool to achieve a political goal.
Right. For decades, the U.S. has relied almost exclusively on overwhelming military coercion to achieve its political ends in the Middle East. It hasn't had to engage in traditional equitable negotiation. It has simply dictated terms from the deck of an aircraft carrier.
Exactly.
But when the munitions run out, the mechanism of coercion fails. And when coercion fails, you are violently forced back into the realm of traditional politics. You can no longer dictate. You actually have to deal with the reality of the other side's leverage and demands.
Because you can't just blow up the negotiating table anymore.
Exactly. And the analysis briefly touches on how the rest of the region is mechanically maneuvering in response to this perceived American weakness. There are frantic talks of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan forming a new joint defense agreement.
Which the analysts find incredibly ironic based on historical data.
Highly ironic. Because, as they point out, Saudi Arabia already had long-standing defense agreements with Pakistan. And historically, what did Pakistan actually do when the Houthis or Iran attacked Saudi oil infrastructure in the past? Absolutely nothing. They didn't deploy troops. These new, hastily drafted alliances aren't signs of strength. They are frantic attempts to build a localized regional security architecture because the traditional guarantor of that security, the United States Navy, is perceived as being structurally out of the game.
It's a scramble for lifeboats because they realize the flagship is sinking, which requires us to look at how this is actually playing out on the ground in real time, outside of the negotiating rooms and think tanks. Because while the diplomats stall and argue over the percentage points of these new transit tolls, the physical reality on the water is shifting dramatically.
The tactical facts on the ground always outpace the political rhetoric in Washington or Tehran.
The intelligence highlights a very specific recent event to prove this. Iran recently fired upon an oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, to understand why this matters, we have to look at the precedent. In the recent past, the U.S. drew a massive hard red line regarding shipping. They explicitly publicly threatened that for every single commercial ship struck by Iran, the U.S. military would mechanically dismantle Iranian infrastructure.
Right, massive retaliation.
They threatened to destroy a major bridge or a vital power plant for every incident, a massive, disproportionate kinetic retaliation.
And what was the actual mechanical response from the U.S. to this most recent tanker strike?
Complete silence. Not a peep from the U.S. military, CENTCOM, or political leadership. No bridges were bombed. No power plants were targeted. The analysts point to this silence as the ultimate, undeniable proof of who actually holds the tactical upper hand.
Yeah, that says it all.
You can debate MOUs and leverage and art of the deal tactics all day long in cable news studios, but when a massive commercial ship gets hit in the most critical choke point on Earth and the global superpower mechanically looks the other way, the debate is over.
It is the starkest possible mechanical evidence of deterrence failure.
Huh.
The threat of force is no longer credible.
And it's not isolated to just Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. The analysts also look at the mechanical situation with the Houthis in Yemen. For years, Saudi Arabia, heavily backed by U.S. intelligence and logistics, waged a brutal, highly advanced air campaign and naval blockade against them.
Right.
But despite all that technology, the analysts argue the Houthis hold all the tactical cards now. Why? Because they control the majority of the physical Yemeni population on the ground. And more importantly, they used incredibly cheap asymmetric weapons drones and basic anti-ship missiles to successfully block maritime traffic in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
They leveraged physical geography and cheap technology to defeat a massively technologically superior force. They broke the maritime insurance market with weapons that cost less than a used car. And by doing so, they completely forced Saudi Arabia to the negotiating table on Houthi terms.
It's a recurring, undeniable theme in this analysis, the triumph of localized supply chains and geography over massive, globalized military budgets. Now, amidst all this heavy, almost apocalyptic geopolitical and economic analysis, I want to take a moment to reflect on the very human element embedded in our source material. Because listening to this deep dive, you get these bizarre, almost jarring moments of conversational whiplash between the experts.
The contrast is quite striking when you listen to the raw audio.
At one point, these two highly credentialed analysts are intensely debating the potential collapse of the global macroeconomic system, the failure of the petrodollar, and the very real outbreak of World War III. And suddenly, they are casually bantering about the psychology of abusive relationships.
Yeah, it just comes out of nowhere.
And one of the speakers, the former CIA official Larry Johnson, completely diffuses the intense tension of the interview by sharing this highly specific, totally random anecdote from a summer job he had in 1977.
Right, he starts talking about working at a Missouri Child Protective Services hotline.
Yes. In the middle of dissecting the collapse of American hegemony, he's talking about taking calls on a 1970s rotary phone from angry ex-husbands who were just trying to get petty revenge on their wives by calling CPS. It's such a weird, lightning moment, but honestly, it serves a profound purpose in the context of geopolitical analysis. It's this incredibly humanizing detail that forces you to remember that these massive, world-altering geopolitical shifts, these movements of multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier strike groups, the drafting of international sanctions, the calculus of global supply chains, they're ultimately being analyzed, managed, and negotiated by flawed, stressed, emotionally driven, ordinary human beings.
It grounds the abstract theory. It reminds us that behind every disastrous policy decision, every catastrophic military blunder, and every economic miscalculation, there is baseline human psychology at play. Egos that refuse to admit defeat, cognitive blind spots built by surrounding yourself with yes-men, and the basic human need to just blow off some steam when the pressure of the world gets too heavy. Geopolitics isn't run by algorithms. It's run by people who used to work summer jobs in Missouri.
Exactly. The human error rate is built into the system. Okay, let's unpack everything we've synthesized today and bring it all the way back to you, the listener. What began as a seemingly localized, simple question about a toll hike in a distant strait, a squabble over a few percentage points on a shipping manifest, has revealed itself to be a fundamental, seismic shift in the mechanical nature of global power.
We are looking at the tectonic plates of a post-World War II world order, physically shifting and grinding against each other.
This isn't just a story about a canal in the Middle East. It is a story about the mechanics of localized supply chains defeating the reach of global superpowers. It's about the very real structural waning power of the U.S. petrodollar system, as rival nations flex their geographic leverage to force global transactions into their own currencies, bypassing the American economic engine entirely.
It's all connected.
It is a world where firing a highly advanced, multi-million-dollar missile to defend your national interests requires you to first get implicit permission from the very adversary country that mines and refines the rare earth minerals you need to build the guidance system.
It is the ultimate paradoxical realization of weaponized globalization. The vast interconnections of trade, logistics, and resource extraction that were supposed to bring the world together in peace are now the very chains being pulled tight to choke economic adversaries.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. I want you to mull this over, mechanically and philosophically, long after this deep dive is over. We have spent the last 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, measuring a country's power and influence by the sheer mathematical size of its defense budget. We measure hegemony by the number of nuclear submarines it commands, the stealth bombers it can put in the air, and the number of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers it sails across the globe to project dominance.
We have relied entirely on the traditional metrics of kinetic military hegemony.
Right. But based on the mechanical realities we've uncovered today, if a nation, no matter how theoretically wealthy it is on paper, cannot independently source the microchips, refine the rare earth metals, and control the basic, unglamorous supply chain components required to physically reload its weapons after the first few weeks of a conflict, does traditional military might actually still exist? Or has the true locus of global power permanently shifted away from the explosives on the battlefield and into the silent, suffocating grip of the supply chain?